The other point about it, however, is through case studies and the use of people that are actually affected. When we take public hearings, they're open, and anybody can attend, and everybody does attend. What I've come to understand is, however, that the personal story, the personal case study, can in fact be as impactful as the well-researched data if one can become convinced that it is telling us a story that has systemic ramifications. In the inquiry that I did on paid parental leave recently, we had many people, children, women and men, crying and putting their personal stories of difficulties. There's a tendency to believe those stories are only for colour. They make the hearings newsworthy. That is not true. Those stories, if they reinforce a trend that is supported both by academic work, by independent research, by a logic framework, they in fact add to the evidence base and should never be underestimated. But the issue is an issue about weighing the evidence, and that's very important to understand. At the end of the day, you can collect all the evidence from all the sources, but at the end of the day, the policy maker, the decision maker, must now weigh that. Just 2 points. For the policy maker, uncertainty is their natural place. Public policy is not based on certainty of information. It is not based on getting it right. Bureaucrats and politicians are forced to say so. It's simply not true. Nothing is right. It may be the right policy for the context and the time that that decision is made. It is always contextual as to place, time, history, culture, context. What it doesn't really happen is certainty. So one of the great issues when you're looking at policy is how do you in fact establish regulation or a regulatory environment that actually deals with uncertainty over time. The great challenge facing the environment issue at the moment is to manage certainty, to manage uncertainty, when in fact the request everybody wants is certainty. It's a very major issue. A second is always to look at the second round effects of whatever you propose. That is to actively understand that just about everything you do in regulatory terms have both perverse and unintended consequences. And it's the extent of that perverseness or the extent of the unintended consequence that needs to be looked at. There is a serious problem in Australia policy making at the moment in the inability to go beyond the first round effects and the impossible difficulty to get people to actually acknowledge that there are second round effects. This means that people constantly say, well, it was unintended. It may have been unintended, but it wasn't unknown. And unknown consequences are entirely different from unintended. Most policymakers simply stop at the first round and not the second or third round effect. In consumer policy, that's critical. You can actually propose regulations which on the surface may in fact enhance consumer protection. But if it so distorts the market, it in fact may cause greater detriment to a much larger number of consumers than was intended. When you're putting that advocacy, one should be saying, are there unintended consequences? What is the extent of that consequence? Is it still reasonable to proceed on that basis? The third point is that regulation is by nature costly. And so the notion of a cost-benefit analysis is critical. I noticed that we made some comments about the broadband initiative recently, about whether or not that had been subject to rigorous cost-benefit analysis. On the other side, I should also say that, of course, the Howard initiatives in relation to industrial relations were never subject to any cost-benefit analysis, nor never undertook a regulatory impact statement either. It is not uncommon for governments on the very big items to ignore their own processes. But the point that I do want to say is regulation has cost, and that has to be acknowledged. So whilst a regulation may achieve your outcome, it is incumbent on advocates to at least acknowledge that the costs associated with that may be substantial, and to at least enter into the discussion about whether or not those costs are in fact justified. In the report, we put forward a framework which was based largely on the work done by the OECD, and in particular by Louise Sylvan, now of our office, and formerly of the ACCC and Choice. I urge you to look at that decision-making framework, that matrix. It puts into a framework everything that I've been saying. It forces you to look at the issues that are of concern, the market, the information failures, the consumer, the way in which consumers actually operate, and indeed, most importantly, consumer expectations. It then requires you to look at the various options for addressing those issues. And then it takes you to the third column, which is, does it actually work? And how do we know that it will work? Does it pass a net benefit test? And does it pass a net benefit test relative to other options? And so the question is not whether the individual recommendation passes the net benefit test, it's whether or not it passes that relative to other things. And the point that I would simply say, sometimes doing nothing is exactly the right response. Policymakers struggle with that. Not very many ministers want to announce nothing. Many of them announce things that amount to nothing, but they don't actually want to stand up and say, it's a nothing policy. So the whole dynamic is to announce something and to do something. I just simply say the Commission is in the luxurious position of occasionally be able to say, do nothing. Rare, but it does happen. Can I just conclude? We could go through a number of case studies, which we've run out of time, but I do think it's absolutely critical that when we're looking at these issues, that we reflect very carefully about what is the evidence base of the problem, what is the evidence base that the solution you're proposing will actually work. But the critical issue in Australia is, in fact, none of that. Because we deal with uncertainty, it is appropriate for governments to act in the absence of perfect knowledge. Otherwise, they would never act. In fact, they would never act in the telecommunications area, where imperfect knowledge seems to be the daily grind, as the markets and the context changes. But it must be incumbent on governments to then evaluate the impacts of those actions and then to change and modify them. In Australia, we have a great problem. We understand how to add, but we've lost the subtract from the calculator. And so what we see in consumer policy is an endless array of additional regulation, rather than what we should see is the replacement of some completely inappropriate and ineffectual regulation. But I've got to tell you, in the consumer policy and the consumer product safety one, it was immensely difficult to get anybody to acknowledge that anything could disappear. Even those that supported a general safety provision or a general unfairness principle into the law, we would say on both occasions, well, what would it replace? And Alan's got views about this, but I have to say most people said in the end, nothing. And again, it was added to it. Now that may be an incorrect analysis, but I would just make the point is it's always better if we can replace things. So this is not a treatise about evidence-based policy, but it might give you some insights as to the need for the good evidence, the way to articulate that evidence, and to have your case heard. Thanks very much.